Hi guys, this is a beginner's guide to houseplant care for beginners. Good one. Right, the first thing we do before we decide we want to plant, what we don't do, I know we do this, but this isn't what we should do. I know we all do it though. Before we buy our plant, we look at our house and think what plant would like to live here. Now I know that's not how it works. It actually works in two ways. One, we're at the garden centre and go, I must have that. Always made in hair ferns, which is so sad, but it's true. I'm still breathy. So sorry. The other thing we do is we are watching YouTube videos. Why can't I sit? We're watching YouTube videos and we see a plant, we think, I'll have that plant. And the person says, it's easy to care for. But they have 200 plants. It's easy for them, but you've only got one. But what we should do is we should look at our house first. We should look at how much room there is. Now, I don't do this enough. My house is, it's not tiny, it's 2-bedroom, but parts of it, like the main bedroom and like the hallway and stuff, they're too cold, and the bathroom are too cold in winter for plants. So when I'm buying plants in summer, so in summer I have plants everywhere and outside as well. All my succulents and snake plants go outside in the summer. So then I go to the houseplant shop and I buy a plant. In winter I have to cram them all in my office and wonder why I spend my life with like plants all on my face. So yeah, realistically you need to look at the space that you have. So yeah, and also the light, which direction your house faces. It doesn't need to make that much of a difference if you want to throw all your money at grow lights, but if you just want to go natural, I've got west-facing window, a lot of west-facing windows and east-facing windows and 3 south-facing windows, and that's really good plant-wise. It's also cold and drafty and a bit damp, so in winter it's not ideal. They all have to cram in here because this is the warmest room. The airing cupboard is over there. If your house gets really cold, then go with plants that are happy with that. Succulents don't mind getting cold. As long as they don't get frost, they're fine. Yucca. There's a few flowering plants like, oh god, what are they called? Those Christmas ones. Poinsettia, they're alright. Some plants like this cold spell. Orchids quite like a cold spell. You can get orchids are like the most numerous plant species out there, family. There's literally thousands. They're found on every continent apart from Antarctica. For now, there's probably one there though. So there will be an orchid that will fit your house needs. What I would recommend doing, and I should have done it earlier, was buying a hygrometer. They're about a tenner, you can get them on Amazon, and it will just tell you how humid your house is. And that will open things up. So if you've got a naturally humid house, so mine's normally between 50 and 60%, that means I can keep things like ferns, peace lilies, calathea, without having to worry about a humidifier. And it just means if you want a plant that needs a humidity, you know you'll need to buy one. If you know you don't want to buy one, then you buy plants that don't need humidity, of which there are plenty. When you're first buying plants, it's preferable to buy them in spring and summer, just because you have a season or two to get used to looking after them before you have to look after them in winter. Plant care tends to be easier in winter because there's less to do. Sort of, it's easier in terms of like time commitments, but in terms of knowing when plants are thirsty or hungry, whether you should fertilise them, whether you shouldn't, whether you need to water them, it's more difficult in winter. So I would buy a houseplant in spring and sort of learn about it, and then by winter you should know more what you're doing. Consider pets before you buy your houseplant. A lot of houseplants are toxic, some more than others. I have rabbits. Oh yeah, that is one thing to consider. So spider plants, for example, and they're a good example for reasons I will go on to explain. Spider plants are non-toxic. So if you've got a cat, you might think, brilliant, I'll get a spider plant. But if your cat eats your spider plant, it will give it a very small high. So cats love spider plants. And I have found in general, if your houseplant won't kill your pet will probably kill your houseplant. So you really need to think of a way to keep them apart. I have rabbits, so I actually live with a houseplant predator, and they love Medallion calathea. Not so bothered about orbifolia. She only ate half of that, but they love them. I used to keep my calathea on the hearth and then I just had they were like caged in, but she got to them. She wanted them bad. Now I just don't have them on the floor. So consider that first. When it comes to picking a plant, I don't think there are any plants that I think don't buy that one because you're a beginner. But there are plants that are more forgiving than others. I personally wouldn't. So there's a bit of a balance. More expensive, bigger, more established plants are easier to care for because they're more established. If you're first getting into plants, you might not want to spend that much on them if you think you might kill them. So you start with smaller ones which are more likely to die. I prefer to start with smaller ones. Yeah, they're more likely to die, but you can learn how to look after them, and it does feel nice watching them grow. So it really depends on how much money you want to chuck at the situation and whether you want to learn about... I wanted to learn about plants and learn how to grow them. If you just want plants to look nice, then just buy a big Monstera and water it every now and again and it will probably be fine. Don't buy discounted plants. I buy discounted plants all the time. I love doing it, and I do occasionally buy ones that I regret. The reasons plants aren't discounted for no reason. You know, they don't have a best before or anything like that. So they will have been discounted for a reason. 9 times out of 10 it's root rot. So if you grab the plant and wiggle it a bit, if it wiggles and doesn't seem to be attached that well to the roots, often they're collapsed a bit inside because the root would have rotted. This is true especially in supermarket plants. God, what did I get? Oh, golden pothos in Sainsbury's. I got one before they were overwatered. Then I went back a few weeks later and they were all discounted and they all were just so sad. I'd have bought them all if I had the room, but they'd have been worth it for the moss balls that came with alone. But I didn't because I really don't have the room. But yeah, the other reason plants are discounted, and this is especially orchids, is they get bugs, and it's always mealybugs on orchids. And if you look behind, the leaves always look fine, but if you look behind the flower head, covered in mealybugs. And I don't know if this is just the garden centres I've been to, but that is a common thing. But a lot of orchid flowers are white, and I don't know if the staff probably don't care. I've worked in retail, I wouldn't have cared, but they probably just don't see the mealybugs. But check, always check. And I have brought home plants with pests on before. I bought a Philodendron tortum with aphids, and on my houseplant tour I said aphids are easy to get rid of, and they are on, I've found on Philodendron. But I have some little lettuce seedlings and they all got eaten by aphids. I was devastated, but it was my own fault. So yeah, RIP little lettuces. I've put some more in, they grow quite quickly. Oh, and they got on my aero garden herbs, so they all had to be washed off. I think we've got it under control now. If you do buy a discounted plant, God, keep it in quarantine. Again, I don't do it because I don't have the room and I'm an idiot, but for your own peace of mind, quarantine it. When you're first looking for a plant and you're a beginner and you have no idea what to pick, ask the people that work there. How knowledgeable they are will vary on. It will depend on where. I mean, you can't go and ask supermarket staff because they will be busy doing other things. But if you go to a garden centre, often there will be at least one person who will be desperate to talk to you about houseplants. So ask them for something that isn't that fussy about light, that is forgiving, that will grow quickly, and that isn't that bothered about water quality. How difficult plants are to care for varies so much and depends so much on the situation you have in your house. The conditions you have in your house, that it's hard to say this plant is a good beginner plant, this plant is a good beginner plant. I don't think snake plants are good beginner plants because they grow so slowly. They're good plants for somebody that wants a home decor item. But if you want to learn about plants, I've mentioned before, I love Aglaonema. They're like an easier to care for calathea, and you get some really, if you like pink plants, there's some really nice pink Aglaonema cultivars. Monstera, they grow big, but you can always cut them back. But that is one thing to consider. But they're really not that fussy, and if you give them the right conditions, they grow so quickly. Peperomia are good if you've only got a small space. They're also really good for propagating because they propagate in some really weird ways. Like I had a pickle lavender, and I took a leaf cutting, and the new leaves that it was growing all grew underwater. I thought it was interesting anyway. Dracaena are a good option. I have this one. This one I got, it was a tiny baby and I cared for it so badly.
But now he's growing really well. He's growing a bit, you can see he's not getting the light that he wants, but he'll go out in summer and I'm hoping that'll straighten him up a bit. But they are really forgiving and happy, and they grow really, really quickly. Most pothos, I've got Scindapsus, Philodendron. Most sort of this kind of heart-shaped leaf, climbing, small leaf, heart-leaf philodendrons. Most of the more common philodendrons are pretty foolproof. Once you start getting into the more expensive like varicosum and stuff, they start getting a bit fussier about humidity and water quality. But that is why I personally think it's better not to spend a lot of money on your first plants, because cheap plants by their nature tend to be easier to care for. The only exception is maidenhair ferns. You need to get your humidity right and your watering right. Obviously in a garden centre situation that's not a problem for them, but those things crisp up literally overnight. So I wouldn't recommend starting with one of those unless you have high humidity and you think you'll be an overwaterer. My maidenhair fern now lives on the windowsill in my bathroom, so I can water it after I've had a shower, because it was the only way I could keep on top of it. I love it, and it got pests, and I think we're down to 2 fronds. Well, it had no fronds. We've got 2 new fronds, and I'm hoping to grow it really big this summer. I think ferns are a great option if you want to learn about plant care, because they do require you to be quite on the ball, whereas a lot of other plants, it's like philodendron, like these, I mean, you could leave them for months, probably literally, and they would get sad and dry, but they wouldn't die. You could bring them back. Whereas a fern, I mean, you shouldn't get into the habit of that, but a fern, they need you to be more present. So that if I feel like I'm getting a bit negligent, then I buy a fern, so it reminds me that I really need to care for these plants. Right, where are we? Right, we've bought our plant. Don't let it get cold on the way home. You don't want it to die before you even manage to get it home. And some plants are really, they will go into shock at the drop of a hat, and it's already quite shocking for them to, I mean, they've already been moved possibly halfway across the world. So we want to keep things as calm as possible for them. So the better garden centres will wrap them up in paper, but as long as you sort of hide them in your coat when you get to the car, they'll probably be alright. And then we need to leave our plant alone. Find it a nice spot somewhere where it gets a nice amount of light, isn't too drafty, and then we leave it alone. We don't repot it straight away, and we don't water it until the water's dry. Often plants in shops can be sopping wet. The ones near us are often, the potting mix is almost pure coir, so they stay wet a long time, so you really need to let them dry out for a bit. I mentioned this in my houseplant mistakes video, but there is a group of houseplant people that always recommend repotting straight away. I don't. I mean, I understand, I mean, it's bugs and things and nasties in the soil, but I prefer to just let my plants acclimatise themselves. If on occasion you might come across a plant that is bone dry, you actually sometimes get succulents in the reduced section because they've just gotten too dry, and when soil gets too dry it clumps together and actually becomes hydrophobic. So if you just water it, the soil will the soil won't do anything. The water will run over the top of the soil and just drip down the sides. It won't penetrate into the soil. So from that we need to just stick it in a bowl of water, a bucket of water, and let the water gradually soak into the bottom of the soil and unhydrophobic it. That's not what the word is. Anyway, but if you see a succulent and you think that's what's happened, just check for mealybugs. Always check for mealybugs. I don't, touch wood, get them that much here. I think some spider mites are more my thing, but a lot of, because they love succulents and houseplant shops tend to usually have a decent selection, and they just get around a lot, so always check for mealybugs. They just look like little white wood lice. When you do water, when the soil has dried out and you do water, make sure you water it thoroughly. So when we talk about overwatering, we mean, say, watering once every day. We don't mean how much water you give it at one time, because ideally any water the plant doesn't want can drain out of the bottom, and then the plant will be left to dry out before it is watered again. So yeah, don't be worried about giving it too much water. It can only hold so much. It'll just pour out the bottom. I do want to mention misting. That is another area of contention in houseplant circles. I don't mist. Some people swear by it and they swear it really helps their plants. And I'm not going to say that they're lying because clearly it does. I don't mist because I can't be bothered. But it's not a substitute for humidity. It can knock dust and bugs off leaves and, you know, just generally keep leaves a bit cleaner, but it will not provide humidity. So if you live in a dry house and you buy a fern, don't just think, well, I can just mist it and it'll be fine. It might be. It will depend on how healthy the fern is and how dry it actually is. But don't be surprised if you still get signs that your plant isn't getting enough humidity just because you've been misting it. Unless you're misting it like constantly, and then you can end up rotting it because it's too wet all the time. So I mentioned not repotting when you bring plants home. I don't repot unless plants are desperately in need of repotting. Being root bound is definitely a thing, and most plants don't like being root bound, but what they do like is being quite snug in their pot. You can easily overwater accidentally if your plant is in too big of a pot, because the soil can just hold so much more water, and that's more water than the plant needs and can get through, and ends up rotting it. I do have a whole video on fertilising, but if you're new to houseplants and you really want to get into them and you want a big collection but you're terrified of fertilising them, don't panic. It's not that big of a deal. It can be, it absolutely can be. You can get a different fertiliser for every different plant you have and have them all on a separate schedule if you want, but you don't need to, and I certainly don't. I have a whole video on it, but generally you want to buy a fairly weak fertiliser. I would go, it'll have 3 numbers on it. I would go 5, 5, 5 or 10, 10, 10. I tend to dilute it so it's half as strong as the manufacturer recommends, because then you're really unlikely to burn your plants. And then every 6 weeks, depending on how fast they're growing, but I go every 6 weeks. You can go every month or every other month if you prefer. Whatever, you know, as long as you're feeding them, it's better than not feeding them. So I tend to do every 6 weeks, regardless of what else is happening. But when you first bring plants home, the potting mixer will have from the garden centre, most of the time, I've never had one that didn't have fertiliser already in it. You can see like it's normally got little blue or yellow balls in it. And that is slow release fertiliser, and that would normally last, I would say, a year, but it's generally sort of 6 months, and then there'll be winter, so you don't really need to fertilise in winter. If your plant's still growing in winter, then go ahead and fertilise, but I wouldn't personally worry about fertilising your plants until you've had them for about a year. I don't anyway, and they're all fine. When you do fertilise, remember that it's much easier on your plant if you fertilise soil that's already damp. If you fertilise and the plant is bone dry, then it can suck up the water too quickly and the fertiliser, and then that can lead to root burn. I go around them all and water them, and then either immediately after or the next day I'll go around and fertilise them all. So they get plain water and then they get fertilised, just to ensure that they don't burn. They probably wouldn't. It's just a risk that I don't think is worth taking for the sake of an extra water. And if you are already doing it every 6 weeks, then you're not gonna, you know, overwatering them every 6 weeks isn't going to be an issue. It's only consistent overwatering that will cause root rot most of the time. When you first start your plant collection, you will probably see a lot of YouTube videos, and you'll go on Pinterest and you will have a whole list of plants that you love. It's really hard to not be influenced by the plants that are in fashion at the time, but it will take a while for you to learn what you actually like to look after. So I love, when I first got into plants, it was when Florida Ghosts were really, really big, and I loved them. I loved the leaf shape so much, and I was going to save up, I was going to get one, but for some reason I could just never really got hold of one. And I'm not one to hunt stuff down online, but I was sort of waiting to get one. But then this Florida Green cropped up, and I found it in my local garden centre, and I realised that, I don't know how much Florida Ghosts are, but they're more expensive than I'm willing to pay. This was $14.99, and it's got the leaf shape that I like. I would consider a Florida Beauty because I do think they're pretty, but this to me is as good as a Florida Ghost. I don't need the white bits on it. I just like the leaf shape, and I love the fuzzy red petioles.
So don't drop a fortune on a plant unless you know you really like it. It's hard to, when you see so many plants and you're not sort of used to seeing them all. Plants like Calathea, I mean, Calathea there's a Dieffenbachia reflector. When I first saw it, I didn't know you could get plants like that, and I was like, oh my god, that is stunning, I need it. But now, realistically, I'm like, they're too big or they're too I'm just not, I would prefer to have a lot of smaller plants than the more expensive ones, but it can take a while for you to really realise what you like to look after. So I love the look of ferns, and I do have three. I have three in a kangaroo paw that's not doing well. But I know they don't fit in that well with the way that I look after my plants. I prefer things that need to dry down a bit before watering them and don't need the high humidity. It's sort of more low maintenance side of things. But you really need to know that before spending all your money on plants that you might accidentally kill, or worse, will become a chore and you don't like them anymore. The one that I think it's like a rite of passage, we all covet, is the Variegated Monstera. The problem with the Variegated Monstera, the elbow, is that it can revert. So if you're new to plant care and you buy one, say you spend £300 on a elbow Monstera, and you don't give it the light that it needs because you don't understand how much light you're getting, you can end up with a plant that is worth like 20 quid because it's gone green and it won't go back. So just try not to buy too many too quickly that you're not sure you can care for. I mean, if they're cheap, fine. So when I got into Calathea, my local garden centre does tiny little baby ones for £5, so that was fine. I could find the ones that did well, the ones that I liked, and buy bigger versions when I saw them. I mean, I haven't, because I'm just growing these ones, but you know what I mean. Don't rush out before you know what you're doing a little bit. Unless you can afford to take the hit, in which case go ahead, but I personally can't. It's also worth doing a little bit of research. If there's something about a plant that you like, say you love the Florida Ghost because you love the idea that the leaves start white and then go green. There are other plants that do that. There's a Syngonium Ice Frost. Mine's over there. There he is. So the leaves, you can't really see because all these leaves are quite old, but they start off pretty much pure white and then they go green over time. These ones are dying. That's a greenish one. It's not as pronounced as on a Florida Ghost, but it does the same kind of thing. And the more light you give it, the whiter they come out. So if you're not sure that you've got the light to really get those really bright whites, you can practice on I think that was about £15 compared to say 150 for a Florida Ghost. I don't know how much they cost. It varies so much. We do all tend to go through phases of the plants we like as well. We all go through a Monstera phase, a Calathea phase, Syngonium phase. Hoya's an expensive one. I do like Hoya, but the more expensive ones are the ones I don't like so much. I think my favourite one is the Bella, which is this one. The blooms are stunning. And I like the Hoya Australis Lisa. How rude. Because the new growth comes out bright pink. And I love that, but I really don't think it's a hobby you need to throw a lot of money at. If you don't have it, there's so many plants that are cheap and common that are still beautiful and really rewarding to look after. I just want to leave you with a little tip for if your plant is struggling. A lot of people use grow boxes to rehab struggling plants, and the reason they do that is it controls the Trinity, which if you remember the Trinity when your plants are struggling and you provide them with those things, it makes it much more likely that you will succeed, and that is light, heat and humidity. Because most tropical plants, a lot of houseplants come from tropical regions, and here in the UK at least, we don't have the light, humidity and warmth that they do in the tropics. So if you increase the warmth, I mean that might just be moving it from, if it's in a cold draft, it might just be moving it. I wouldn't suggest you put your plants near the radiator, but there's things like heat mats that can help, or even just moving it to a warmer room of the house. And then light, obviously plants need light to grow.
and it's the thing that makes the biggest difference. If you want to grow your plant bigger or faster, give it more light. That will really, really help. But remember, the more light you give, the more water you need to give, because it'll be growing. Not only will the plant be using more water, but it will also more will evaporate. And the third thing is humidity. So watering your plants, yeah, if you let your plants dry out, they will need watering. But watering is something most of us can grasp, as long as we don't forget or overwater. And a lot of people overwater. I think most people overwater, but I just forget. But these are things you can curb by setting reminders and think that's sort of you control it from your end, and you do with humidity. But people, when you say you need to water your plant more or less, people are like, yeah, I'll do that. But if you say you need to increase the humidity, they're like, oh, is that really that important? It is, if your plant is struggling, and it can really make a difference, and it can really improve the size and shape of leaves and just the way it grows, how fast plants unfurl, the leaves unfurl, that sort of thing makes a massive difference. And if your plant is struggling, improving light, temperature and humidity are your best bet of your plant pulling through. When it comes to equipment that you might need, I'm of the opinion that you don't really need a lot of stuff. You don't need a special watering can or something. A measuring jug will do. But I would recommend a moisture meter. And that's a bit controversial because they're not that accurate, but whilst they're not that accurate, they're also not that expensive. And with some plants, they're really helpful. And they're helpful when you're beginning. They tend to come in quite a dense mix. And the denser the soil, the more accurate the moisture meter will be, just because of the way they work. They measure conductivity, I think. So I would, whilst they're not the definitive way to tell if your plants are wet, they will help you learn, and they will sort of bridge that gap of knowledge whilst you learn. I still use mine sometimes if I'm really not sure. So it's a bit more like a second opinion. But as you become more knowledgeable than the moisture, in the beginning, if you don't know anything, the moisture meter knows more than you, and it's just bridging the gap until you know more than it. You're a team. It's not, it's not one or the other. But as you use better and better mixes, not better, well, no, they are better. But we tend to graduate to a more airy mix because they allow the plants to grow stronger roots. The moisture meters become less and less accurate. But if you're not into aroids or things that need an area mix, then it doesn't really matter. Well, I hope that was helpful. Feel free to ask any questions. I will leave any relevant blog posts underneath. I hope I didn't waffle on too much, but I know that I did. So, sorry. I will see you next week. Thank you for watching. Bye.